The fluorescent lights of the studio hummed their usual morning tune, that barely audible frequency that television people stop noticing after their first week on the job. Stagehands moved with purpose, adjusting camera angles and checking audio levels. The famous round table sat center stage, polished to perfection, waiting for the day's guests. It was a Tuesday morning in New York City, and for the production team of American Voices, it looked like any other show day. They had no idea they were about to witness something that would be replayed and discussed for years to come. At 69 years old, Margaret "Maggie" Hollister arrived with the quiet confidence of someone who has nothing left to prove. She stepped out of a black SUV at exactly 8:45, 15 minutes earlier than her call time, a habit she had developed back when she was a girl in rural Missouri. On her family's farm, you didn't wait until the last minute to feed the cattle, and you didn't keep people waiting. That work ethic had followed her through 5 decades of stardom, through 42 #1 hits, through the kind of tragedy that would have broken someone with less steel in their spine. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress, her famous silver hair swept back in a style that was both practical and glamorous. As she walked through the studio doors, she greeted everyone by name. She asked the security guard about his daughter's soccer game. She thanked the makeup artist before the woman even introduced herself. This was not calculated charm. This was simply how Maggie Hollister moved through the world, treating everyone she met like they mattered. She was there to promote Open Road, her latest album, a deeply personal collection of songs reflecting on a life fully lived. She was also there to talk about her work on Rising Star, the talent competition where she had spent the last 8 seasons mentoring young singers. Her publicist had called this a victory lap, a chance to celebrate an incredible career while looking toward the future. The show's producers had promised a friendly, upbeat conversation. Wanda Morrison, the show's longtime host, opened the segment with genuine warmth and admiration. She had known Maggie for years and considered her a friend. "Our next guest is someone who needs no introduction to anyone in America," Wanda said, her voice filled with affection. "She has sold over 80 million records. She has starred in her own television show. She has won every award this industry has to offer. And she continues to shape the future of music as a coach on Rising Star. Please welcome the one and only, Maggie Hollister." The applause was immediate and thunderous. The studio audience, a mix of New Yorkers and tourists, rose to their feet. Maggie stood and placed her hand over her heart, that simple gesture of gratitude that had become her signature. She waved to the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as she could, before taking her seat at the table. "Well, goodness gracious," she said, her Missouri accent warm and unhurried. "Y'all are going to make an old woman cry before we even get started. Thank you so much for that welcome." The conversation began exactly as planned. Bethany Winters, a younger co-host who had grown up listening to Maggie's music, asked about the inspiration behind Open Road. Maggie's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who still loves her craft after all these years. "This album is different for me," Maggie explained, leaning forward in her chair. "It's about looking back at the roads I've traveled, the people I've loved and lost, the lessons I've learned along the way. There's a song called Missouri Sky that I wrote about my daddy and that old farm. It's a thank you letter to the places that made me who I am." Bethany nodded thoughtfully. "That's beautiful. And speaking of mentorship, you've worked with so many young artists on Rising Star. What's the most important thing you try to teach them?" Maggie smiled warmly. "When I started out in Nashville, I didn't have anyone to show me the way. I walked into rooms where people told me I was too country, then walked into other rooms where they told me I wasn't country enough. I learned by falling down and getting back up. So when I work with these young people, I tell them to stay true to who they are. The world will try to shape you into what it wants. Don't let it." The audience was captivated. This was the Maggie they had invited into their homes for 40 years, the woman whose voice had been the soundtrack to their lives. The other hosts asked follow-up questions about her tour, her family, her thoughts on the current state of music. Everything was flowing smoothly. Then Linda Crane leaned forward, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Linda had been a co-host on American Voices for 12 years. She was known for her sharp tongue and her willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. But what happened next went far beyond tough journalism. It was something else entirely. "So, Maggie," Linda began, her voice carrying that distinctive edge that regular viewers knew meant trouble was coming. "You've been doing this country music thing for what, 4 decades now? Don't you ever get tired of singing about the same things over and over? Pickup trucks and dirt roads and heartbreak. It all seems a little, how should I put this, limited in scope." The question landed like a grenade in the middle of the table. The studio went completely silent. Bethany Winters looked down at her notes. Another co-host, a political commentator named Patricia, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Wanda Morrison's smile froze on her face. Maggie's expression remained pleasant, but those who knew her well could see the subtle change. A slight tightening around have recently come to light, are what connect Andrew's disgrace directly to the current king, and by extension, cast a long shadow over the entire family. According to a bombshell report, the settlement, rumored to be in the region of $12 million, wasn't just paid by the late queen. It was a family affair. Around $7 million came from the queen's private estate. Another $3 million came from the estate of her husband, the late Prince Philip. And crucially, around $1.5 million came from the personal funds of the then Prince of Wales, the man who is now King Charles. This changes everything. For a long time, the narrative pushed by the palace was that the Andrew mess was a problem inherited from the previous reign. It was the late queen's fault, the briefing suggested. She was too soft on her favorite son. She allowed him to walk her into a memorial service. She indulged him. Poor King Charles, we were led to believe, was left with an unexploded bomb that his mother had carelessly handed to him. It was a disgraceful attempt to smear the legacy of a woman who had served her country for 70 years, all to protect the current monarch. But the money trail tells a very different story. If Charles was writing checks to silence Andrew's accuser, he wasn't a bystander. He wasn't an innocent victim of his mother's indulgence. He was a co-conspirator in a cover-up. He was making a hard-nosed political calculation that it was better to pay off a woman who accused his brother of sexual abuse than to let the 4 women in this industry. When I started out, women weren't supposed to headline tours. Women weren't supposed to sell out arenas. Women weren't supposed to have the kind of career I've had. Every door I walked through, I held open for the women coming behind me. She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength with every word. I have championed artists of every background you can imagine. I have used my platform to lift up voices that the Nashville establishment wanted to ignore. I have produced albums for young singers who couldn't get meetings with record labels because they didn't fit the mold. So don't you dare sit there and lecture me about inclusivity when you have never walked a single mile in my boots. Linda crossed her arms, her expression hardening into a mask of defiance. I'm not lecturing. I'm asking questions that need to be asked. You've built an empire on this sweet, wholesome, Southern girl image. But how much of that is actually real, Maggie? How much of that charm is carefully calculated for the cameras? How much of that accent is just part of the brand? The question was so profoundly insulting, so deliberately designed to wound at the most personal level, that a low murmur of disapproval rippled through the audience. People shifted in their seats, exchanging shocked glances. This had crossed a line, and everyone in the room knew it. But Maggie did not flinch. Instead, something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The warm, gracious entertainer who had walked into the studio that morning was gone. In her place stood a woman who had buried friends, who had rebuilt her life from ashes, who had faced down every obstacle the music industry could throw at her, and who was no longer interested in being accommodating. You want to know if my accent is real, Linda? Maggie's voice was quiet but carried a weight that filled every corner of the studio. This accent comes from a place called Hickory County, Missouri, population back then about 8,000 people spread out over miles of farmland. This accent comes from helping my daddy bale hay before the sun came up and doing my homework by lamplight because we were saving money on electricity. This accent comes from a life you couldn't begin to understand from your high-rise apartment on the Upper West Side. She slowly rose from her seat, her full presence commanding the room in a way that reminded everyone why she had been filling arenas for 4 decades. The cameras captured every moment, every nuance of her expression. You want to know if my charm is calculated? Let me tell you about charm, Linda. Charm is what you learn when you're a woman in a man's industry and you have to smile through every slight, every dismissal, every record executive who pats you on the head and tells you you're pretty but you'll never make it. Charm is what gets you through the door when talent alone isn't enough. And yes, I've used it. Because that's what survivors do. We use every tool we have. Linda tried to interject, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. I'm simply questioning whether the public image matches the private reality. It's a legitimate question for someone in the public eye. No. Maggie's voice cut through the studio like a blade. It is not a legitimate question. You're not questioning. You're attacking. There's a profound difference. You've spent the last 20 minutes dismissing my genre, dismissing my audience, questioning my authenticity, and belittling my entire life's work. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. That's just mean. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Linda's smirk finally vanished, replaced by something that looked like a mix of embarrassment and the beginnings of genuine anger. I think you're being oversensitive, Linda said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. These are legitimate questions about authenticity and representation in media. It's my job to ask them. Oversensitive? Maggie laughed, but there was absolutely no humor in it. Honey, I have been called every name in the book by people a whole lot meaner and more powerful than you. I have been told I was too country for pop and too pop for country. I have been told I was too old to be relevant 20 years ago. I have survived a plane crash that took people I loved like family. I have stood in a courtroom and faced the people responsible for that crash. I have rebuilt my life from nothing. And you think a few snide comments from someone who has never created a single piece of art in her entire life are going to make me oversensitive? She shook her head slowly, her expression one of profound disappointment mixed with something that looked almost like pity. You know what the real shame is here, Linda? You had an opportunity. You had a chance to have a real conversation about music, about art, about what it takes to stay relevant for 4 decades in an industry that chews people up and spits them out. You could have asked about songwriting, about mentorship, about how the music industry has changed since I started. Instead, you chose to be dismissive and condescending, because that's easier than actually engaging with someone whose life experience is different from your own. Wanda Morrison finally attempted to intervene, her voice gentle but carrying the authority of someone who had been hosting this show for over 20 years. Okay, I think we've touched on some very interesting points here. Maybe we should redirect the conversation back to the album and the tour. But Maggie was not finished. The floodgates had opened. After 40 years of gracefully deflecting criticism with a smile, she was finally giving voice to something far more powerful than politeness. No, Wanda. With all due respect, I think this needs to be said. I think America needs to hear it. She turned back to Linda, her eyes never wavering. You asked if country music speaks to real issues. Let me tell you about some of the real issues I've sung about. I've sung about a woman finding the courage to leave an abusive husband, to pack her kids in the car and drive away from everything she knew because staying meant dying. I've sung about a factory worker watching his job get shipped overseas and having to tell his family that he doesn't know how he'll provide for them. I've sung about a teenager struggling with their faith in a world that seems to have lost its way. I've sung about the quiet, uncelebrated dignity of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Her voice was rising now, filled with the passion that had made her concerts legendary, that had moved millions of people to tears and laughter and hope. Those are real issues. They might not be your issues, but they are real to the millions of people who find comfort and strength in those songs. And you know what? Those people you so casually dismiss as a certain demographic, they are the nurses and the teachers and the truck drivers and the farmers. They are the people who get up every single day and keep this country running while you sit here making clever, cynical comments about them from behind this desk. She gestured toward the audience, toward the cameras, toward the millions of people watching at home. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to have those stories treated with respect, not sneered at by someone who has never bothered to understand them. They deserve to know that their lives matter, that their experiences are valid, that they don't need permission from anyone on a television show to be proud of who they are and where they come from. The audience began to stir. You could feel the energy shifting, the support building for Maggie. People were nodding. Some were dabbing at their eyes. This was no longer an interview. It was something historic. Linda made one last attempt to regain control of the crumbling situation. I never said those people don't matter, she insisted, her voice strained and defensive. I am simply pointing out a trend. Country music has become increasingly insular, increasingly. Increasingly what? Maggie interrupted, her voice sharp and clear. Increasingly popular. Increasingly successful. Country music is one of the fastest growing genres in the entire world right now. We're selling out stadiums in Europe and Australia. We're breaking streaming records. Artists from every genre are incorporating country elements into their music. If that's your definition of insular, then I don't know what mainstream looks like. She took a step closer to the table, her eyes locked on Linda's face with an intensity that made several people in the studio hold their breath. But that's not really what bothers you, is it? What bothers you is that country music represents values you don't share. What bothers you is that millions of people find meaning and hope in songs about faith and family and hard work. What bothers you is that there's a whole world out there, a huge part of this country, that does not need your approval to exist and thrive. The observation was so piercingly accurate that Linda actually flinched. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked truly uncomfortable, truly unsure of how to respond. The studio had become a pressure cooker of emotion. Every person in the room, from the production assistants huddled in the corners to the camera operators who were trying to remain professional, felt the weight of what was happening. This was no longer a television interview. This was a moment that would be studied and discussed for years to come. Maggie straightened her jacket with the calm, precise movements of someone who had made a final decision. The gesture was small but significant. It signaled that she was done, that she had said what needed to be said, and that she was preparing to leave. I've been doing interviews for 40 years, she said, her voice quieter now but no less powerful. I've talked to thousands of journalists, sat on countless couches and chairs just like this one. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've been treated with this kind of disrespect. Not because people always agreed with me, but because they at least did me the courtesy of engaging with who I actually am instead of who they had decided I must be. Linda opened her mouth to respond, but Maggie held up her hand. The simple gesture commanded an authority that silenced the entire room. It was the kind of presence that couldn't be manufactured, couldn't be learned. It came from a lifetime of commanding stages, of holding thousands of people in the palm of her hand. I'm going to tell you something my mama taught me a long time ago, Linda. She said that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them the first time. And you've shown me, and everyone watching, exactly who you are today. You're someone who would rather tear down than try to understand. Someone who mistakes cynicism for sophistication. Someone who thinks that dismissing other people's lives and experiences makes you smarter than them. She paused, letting the words sink in. The silence in the studio was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. But here's what you don't understand. I've faced down people a whole lot more powerful than you. I've survived things that would have ended most careers. I've buried people I loved and found a way to keep living. And I've done it all by staying true to who I am, not by becoming someone else to please critics who were never, ever going to be pleased anyway. Then, in a moment that would become iconic, she turned away from Linda. She turned away from the table. And she faced the camera directly. She spoke not to the hosts, not to the studio audience, but to the millions of people watching at home, the people who had supported her for 40 years, the people whose lives she had touched with her music. To everyone watching who has ever been made to feel like the music you love isn't real music. To anyone who has ever been made to feel like your values aren't sophisticated enough, or your stories don't matter because you come from a small town instead of a big city. To anyone who has ever been told that your experiences are too simple, your dreams too small, your life not worthy of attention. Her voice softened, filling with the warmth that had made her a beloved figure for so long. I want you to know something. Your stories matter. Your experiences are valid. The love you feel for your family, the pride you take in your work, the faith that gets you through hard times, that's all real. That's all important. And you do not need permission from anyone on a television screen to be proud of who you are and where you come from. The audience began to applaud. It started softly, with just a few people, but it quickly built into something significant. People were rising to their feet. Some were crying. The applause grew louder and louder, a thunderous ovation that filled the studio and echoed through the speakers. Maggie acknowledged them with a small nod, a grateful smile, her hand over her heart once more. Then she gathered her things, the simple purse and folder she had brought with her that morning, and prepared to leave. She looked at the panel one final time, her gaze settling on Linda, who sat frozen in her chair, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at the woman who had just dismantled her arguments with such grace and precision. I came here today hoping to have a nice conversation about music and mentorship. Instead, I got a reminder of why so many people out there feel like the media doesn't understand them or respect them. I hope you think about that, Linda. I hope you think about the message you sent today to everyone watching who loves country music. You told them their culture doesn't matter. You told them their stories are too simple. You told them they're not sophisticated enough for your table. She shook her head slowly, a look of genuine sadness on her face. Not anger anymore. Just disappointment. That's not going to change what I do or how I do it. I'm going to keep singing songs that mean something to real people. I'm going to keep mentoring young artists who deserve a chance. I'm going to keep being exactly who I am, accent and all, because that's what my mama taught me, and that's what's gotten me through 69 years of life in this beautiful, complicated, wonderful country. And with that, Maggie Hollister walked off the stage. She didn't rush. She didn't storm off in a huff. She walked with the measured, confident stride of someone who knew exactly who she was and had no need to prove anything to anyone. Her head was held high. Her back was straight. Her dignity was completely intact. The studio sat in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the image of Linda Crane sitting alone at the famous table. For the first time that morning, she looked small. The confident, combative interviewer was gone, replaced by a woman who seemed to be shrinking into her chair, the weight of what had just happened settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. The other hosts looked at each other, unsure of what to say, how to fill the void that Maggie's departure had left. Wanda Morrison finally spoke, her voice soft and a little shaky. Well, that was certainly a powerful conversation. We're going to take a quick break. The red lights on the cameras clicked off. The show went to commercial. And in the control room, producers were already rewinding the footage, already realizing that they had captured something extraordinary. What had begun as a routine promotional appearance had transformed into something far more significant. It was a moment when a woman who had built a career on grace and warmth finally said, "Enough." It was a powerful demonstration that true strength isn't about volume, but about conviction. It was a reminder that some people are never more formidable than when they speak softly and carry the heavy weight of truth. In the green room, Maggie accepted a bottle of water from a trembling production assistant. She thanked the young woman warmly, asked her name, told her she was doing a great job. The assistant later said that Maggie seemed completely calm, completely at peace, as if she had simply done what needed to be done and was ready to move on with her day. Outside the studio, a small crowd had gathered. Word was spreading on social media. People held up their phones, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. When Maggie emerged, they cheered. She waved, signed a few autographs, posed for a few photos. She was the same woman she had always been. Back in the studio, the show continued. But something had changed. The energy was different. The questions were softer. The hosts seemed subdued, aware that they had witnessed something historic, something that would be talked about long after today's other segments were forgotten. And as the days passed, the reaction was overwhelming. Social media exploded with support for Maggie. Clips of the confrontation were viewed millions of times. Talk shows dissected every moment. Journalists wrote think pieces about what it meant, about the cultural divide it exposed, about the way one woman's dignity had exposed another woman's cruelty. Linda Crane issued a carefully worded statement about the importance of asking hard questions, but few were buying it. The public had made up its mind. They had seen a legend attacked and had watched her respond with a grace and power that left no doubt about who was in the right. Maggie Hollister, for her part, said very little in the days that followed. She let the moment speak for itself. She went back to what she had always done. She worked on her music. She mentored young singers. She lived her life. But something had shifted in the culture. A line had been drawn. And everyone who watched that morning knew exactly which side they were on. The queen of country music had faced down a challenger on national television, and she had done it with the same blend of grace and steel that had made her a legend in the first place. The applause from that studio audience, still ringing in the stunned silence after her exit, was the final verdict. The queen had not just survived the confrontation. She had reigned. And in doing so, she had spoken for millions of Americans who had long felt dismissed and misunderstood, giving voice to their experiences and reminding them that their stories mattered. It was a moment that would echo through television history, a reminder that some battles are won not with shouting, but with truth. And Maggie Hollister, the girl from the Missouri farm, had won the biggest battle of her public life by simply being exactly who she had always been.